Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. On behalf of Sattva and Sattva Knowledge Institute, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all. Sattva Knowledge Institute, or SKI, is our official knowledge platform at Sattva. The SKI platform aims to guide investment decisions for impact, shedding light on urgent problems and high potential solutions, so that the stakeholders can build a greater awareness and a bias towards concerted actions. Our focus is on offering solutions over symptoms, carefully curating strong evidence-based research, and engaging decision makers actively with our insights. Our series of webinars, Touchpoint, is designed as a set of knowledge-driven interactions with the members of Sattva Knowledge Institute and also the eminent sectoral experts. During these interactions, we introduce our audience to key topics where we see the need to drive societal change, and also interest and traction across the ecosystems by bringing in evidence-backed, actionable insights. I'm one of your hosts today. My name is Tripti Naswa. I lead the Livelihood Practice Area at Sattva Knowledge Institute. I have with me my colleague, Sadhana, who will be co-hosting the session with me. We work closely to create knowledge at the Livelihood Practice Area at SKI, particularly in the area of women economic empowerment. Women labor force participation in India, especially the low and the declining trend, has been an area of concern. Also investigation of many practitioners for a long time now. And we see a lot of concerted efforts to increase this rate at the national level by the government, as well as many stakeholders who are working in the social sector. We at SKI believe that it is our responsibility as an ecosystem player to uncover all the aspects which can help us understand the reasons behind this trend, and thus inform livelihood interventions to have more positive outcomes. In our exploratory journey so far, which is essentially supported by our experience on the ground and also evidence-backed research, we are beginning to understand that the low participation rate is a result of multiple factors. And these include issue on the supply side, that is, women are not participating in work, and of course, multiple factors which influence the same. Issues on the demand side, that is, the market is not able to provide the conducive environments or jobs which might be suited to the aspirations of women. And many studies have shown, positive an environment can actually create much more participation of women. Also, the third thing that we are identifying is that there are systemic gaps in how we measure and report women's labor and the factors which influence their participation. In today's webinar, we'll focus on sharing our learnings in this journey, highlighting the systemic gaps, the need to mainstream gender-sensitive data collection, and the statistical methodologies to better understand the nature of women's work and the true value of their contribution to the economic development as well as the societal well-being. Can we move to the agenda slide, please? So the agenda of our discussion is divided in three parts, right? We'll have the webinar across these three key parts. First part will focus on understanding the relationship between women's work, how they are participating today in the workforce in India, and the data which is available today. And the second part of our webinar will focus on deep diving into the methodological issues in measuring women's work, where we will look into existing statistical methods. The third part and the final, the concluding part, will focus on actionable outcomes for all of us, the practitioners who are working in the area of women economic empowerment, highlighting the especially the tracks where we feel the solutions should focus on to strengthen the discourse of women economic empowerment in India using data. We will then conclude with a Q&A where we will take questions from you all. My request is that please do put all the questions on the chat. Even if you come across like any question during the course of the webinar, do put them on chat and we will take them up at the end of the session. In case we miss out responding to your questions, please be assured that we will respond to these questions offline subsequent to the discussion. During the course of our discussion, we will also draw upon the knowledge, the recent knowledge product, that we have launched specifically around the topic of discussion today, which is rethinking ways of measuring women's labor in India. And we would like to thank experts like Dr. Vanita Viswanathan, Professor Sona Mitra, Mitali Nikor, and Dr. Sugandha Nagpal, who have guided us to build this narrative. You can also access our knowledge product. The link is pasted in the chat. All right, so let's move to the next slide. And before we deep dive into, the research, that the findings that we have for you and, what we want to share with you, we would like to hear from you all. Especially, the practitioners and enthusiasts, who want to strengthen women livelihood, thoughts on this poll that we have organized on the Mentimeter. I'll request the team to please put that the link up. So you can find this, code on the slide and you can go to the link. And we have listed down 2 questions for you to, share your thoughts with us. And it's really, we want to understand that how many of you feel like, if the women's work is correctly understood and appropriately represented in the data and the statistics as we see today. Interesting. We feel that it somewhat, doesn't represent, accurately represents the women's, work. But yeah, a lot of you feel that it, all the data and the statistics doesn't really represent it accurately. And a lot of it is, how we understand today as well. In our research, we have interestingly found out that, there are 2 parts to the data and the statistics. One is what is being reported and what, you understand from that, that data. So, and a lot gets lost in translation as well. So, we do understand, why we have almost equal mixed responses here. I think we can move to the next question. So the next question is, in your opinion, what is the main impediment to women's full agency and dignity in labor markets? Can we put the code in the chat as well? Double blind, inequity, network gaps, lack of mentorship. There's a lot on the agency of the woman, herself, and women-friendly policies, safe workspaces, informal economy. Patriarchy is like one of the biggest, factors. The power dynamics, of course, they play a significant role for, women across different, working across different, coming from different backgrounds, etc. Lack of quality education, social norms, gender roles. Yeah, I think we're waiting for another, and let us give another, 10 seconds or so. Thank you for sharing your responses. A lot is in line with what the research actually, a lot of evidence says, and also the what the reality today is, right? In specifically in terms of the women who are participating, because when we talk about women, labor force, we are not just talking about the 10% of us, right, like who are working in the formal economy, but there we are talking a lot about 90% of the women who are working in informal economy, and these factors significantly impact them. We see it even in mainstream industries for a lot of us, but I think specifically for women, working in the informal economy, which is 90% of the working women, these factors impact them a lot. And also, I would say not just in terms of limiting their access to work, but also, influencing the way they participate in work, right? The way they contribute their labor to the economy. We'll uncover all of this as we, go into the webinar. So thank you so much again. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So now as we begin, we can go to the next slide. I want to spend some time on how we are investigating the problem of women labor force participation in India, and what influenced us to form the hypothesis that there is a need to strengthen gender sensitive and contextual data to understand women's labor in India and their participation in the workforce. In our research, we have examined three key pillars critical to understand women's work and data. Number one is the data sets which inform us where Indian women are working and how this fragmented data can be better understood to characterize women's work in India. Number two, we've looked at the factors which impede the ability of the statistics themselves and the data to present an inclusive, comprehensive, and holistic pictures of women's work in India. Number three, then we deep dived into framing a contextual understanding of how women in India navigate their participation in the workforce and the determinants of their labor. The results of our research show that the prevalent methods of counting work and productivity can be improved to acknowledge women's labor and their contribution to the economy. Second, it also highlighted that the gender sensitive and the contextualized data has an immense potential to both inform the problem assessment before we get to the solution, right? As well as the intervention development to achieve positive outcomes for women economic empowerment. Can we move to the next slide? So I will now get into the data sets that we have examined so far and how we think that they are helping us in identifying the characteristics of women participation in the workforce. And of course, some gaps that we see in this data, right? Now, when it came to the data sets informing labor force participation, we started by asking ourselves a few fundamental questions. Number one, for example, was how many women are working in India, the nature of their employment, and the other question was where are really women working in India, right? Before we get to understanding where this number is coming from, we wanted to uncover all of these things. And we found out that the different data sets highlight different characteristics of women participation in the workforce. And I want to begin with the labor force participation rate, a data set which is today referred by a lot of people. And when we looked at the PLFS, we realized that it can help us understand how women in diverse contexts participate in the workforce and the ways in which they navigate through their work or contribute their labor. Now, if you see the LFPR as reported by World Bank, etc., for India is at 30%, right? It reports that 166 million women in India are working or are seeking work. However, recent work by Economic Advisory Council for the PM highlighted that the LFPR for India is 46.2%, reflecting the underreporting of women's labor and the gap in which it is measured today. So, while looking at both the statistics and different sources, we did realize that one, can this data help us understand how women in different diverse contexts participate? For example, if we take specifically the case of Indian women, participating in informal economy, many take work, their work to homes, right? They bring back work to home, but they are often not accounted in the PLFS data as we see today. And that is something the Economic Advisory Council for the PM also highlighted. And it's interesting to see that, if we kind of go deeper into defining some of these things better, that, we should look at designing statistical methodologies which are suited to the context of our country. We also found out that not all women stay out of work because of the social norms. There are many factors which influence their participation, and the nature of employment available significantly impacts that, right? If we see 90% of the women in paid jobs are working in informal sector, and informal sector is often characterized by high levels of precarity, poor working conditions, and very limited access to institutional support and welfare. And that limits the way, women participate. And, whether it meets their expectations and aspirations or not is also an important question that, one needs to explore. Finally, we saw that the women in India and their way of participation in the economy is diverse in nature. Women participate as workers, as entrepreneurs, as self-employed individuals, or in collectives, right? But the statistical measures, methods that we use fail to showcase such diversity, or sometimes fail to include the labor of all women, under each category. Further, we understood if we take the case of the sectors in which the women work, and specifically, if we look at the number of 23.9 million women workers work in the industry, and look at Tamil Nadu as an area, we see more women, roughly about 60% of the women, participate, in the industries are participating from Tamil Nadu. So this data also helps us understand the local contextual realities, thus exhibiting a high level of regional diversification. So we looked at all of this to understand, can we go deeper into the characteristics of women's labor participation in India beyond what the numbers actually report, right? And I would like to call out that there are many other data sets which can be used, and perhaps we will be using in our, our further research. But at this stage, these data sets have formed a large part of our evidence building. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, post the examination of the data sets, we came to understand that a range of factors impede the ability of the statistics and the data to present an inclusive, comprehensive, and the holistic picture of women's work in India. And we can look at it in two parts, right? There are limitations because of the very nature of the statistical methods themselves, right? If we look at LFPR, is a binary indicator. It says either you are in the labor force or you're out of labor force, right? Even though whether the individual is in the workforce or not is a function of both availability of work as well as individuals' willingness to, to work, right? Now, when it comes to comes up in the questionnaire in the context of the women often consider in between jobs as a period when they are not working. So they really then are considered as, out of workforce, and thus it, this entire data and their response leads to the manifestation of low LFPR, right? But if we see that, the Indian women continue to work navigating through the context in which they operate, whether it is taking care of, their family responsibilities and navigating through work, or, whether it is supporting the collectives that they are a part of. So they continue to work, but the binary nature of the LFPR limits this, identification of this kind of, the labor of women. And in some sense, through our research, we've also understood the value that the women add to the economy can be seen across the spectrum, and not just as the economic value, right? It is also the social value, it's the community value, because if from a care point of view, we see that women do demonstrate that there is a significant potential for the care economy to eventually evolve in our country, and then the investments that they do to take care of the children is like a future, can be considered as a significant amount of future investment into the future of the country, right? And these are certain things which we feel that the statistics should work on and should be able to highlight. Further, there are structural reasons why women's work is poorly understood, right? There is high informality and volatility in the labor market, which is not visible in the official accounts. Women lack access to income generating activities. Women's disproportionate role in performing unpaid care work is definitely one of the most important reasons for why women's work is poorly understood. The diversity of the roles occupied by Indian women in economy and the society, like I mentioned, in collectives, as self-employed, as informal workers, and then the close intertwining of women's life with their labor with no clear compartmentalization. And this can be understood with the example of the family enterprises, women are a part of, right? Often, even in agriculture, enterprises in agriculture value chain, where you will see that women may not be going to the market because of the very nature of the markets itself, but they will be playing a role, strongly participating, in either production activity or, or value addition, etc., at the back end, and also at the same time managing the work that they do at home. And this leads to, in some sense, a lack of compartmentalization of their work, and their labor is not accounted for. And also then there are several factors like caste, class, religion, which still continue to affect or are a strong reason as to why women's work is not really accounted for, right? And all these lead to that factor. And of course, there are a lot of material consequences we feel as a result of this lack of understanding. One can see that especially in terms of inequitable and skewed allocation of resources, insufficiently nuanced targeting of interventions, policy making, limited like systemic progress. So we see a lot of these consequences of these, because of the lack of understanding of the nature of the woman's work. After reviewing these data sets and the limitations, we really felt that we need to go deeper into the qualitative aspect of understanding, how women in India are navigating their work and what determines their participation. So I'll move to the next slide. So if you see that, we understand that the women's work is a composite whole of several moving parts. And these parts are sensitive to a range of external factors, such as, what you highlighted as deeply entrenched patriarchal norms, constraints on education, mobility, the absence of an enabling policy ecosystem, as well as the lack of availability of decent jobs, right, commensurate with their qualifications. In one of the one of the field visits, we met a lot of women who were educated and wanted to work, especially in places where they can get dignified jobs, right? But, as you go on the ground, the reality is that they are not available for them, right? So our first principle of understanding this is based on the fact that a livelihood strategy of a woman, or, for a large part of India, cannot be looked at, in isolation. It is really a strategy of life. And if you take one woman and say, what are really the touch points of her interactions, we understand that, we will begin to understand and unfold that all of these factors, for example, her immediate household, that's why, you see in the figure here, we've talked about the determinants of women's labor, and household factors are the immediate factors which influence her participation and the way she works. And then there are externalities, right? Of course, first and foremost is her own agency to participate. A woman with skills, motivation, capacity and aspirations will probably, figure out a way to participate. And also, we have seen this, they also navigate through social norms, figure out the way they want to work, right? And next comes a combination of factors, like I said, within the household. If just to, sort of shed some light on what these household factors could be, which determine her participation, of course, the first is the social, factors, which includes patriarchal norms restricting women's mobility, if not necessarily her participation, education, access to finance, as well as digital access, right? In many cases, we see, the boys have mobile phones while the women do not, right? And also, while the norms are changing, but there is still prioritization of women's role within the household as caregiver, as a house worker. Then there are economic factors. If the household is in economic distress, the women will, necessarily take the necessary step and participate in the economic activities. But if there is enough income, then women may not, even though she might have the right kind of skills, or she might have participated earlier, in the economy. And then there are environmental factors, where we look at the cultural and the community norms, which are internalized in the household, right? Like of living in a culture. So there are different, because of living in a certain way for many years, then there are several factors which influence the participation of women, right? Now, we are not saying that, we can change all of this and there is a need to change all of this. I think a lot is changing as we speak within the communities, but we need to be cognizant of these factors in order to really design the interventions better, right? Because we need to take women along, and what they feel about these factors is something that we need to further understand and explore with them as well, right? And then finally, the legal and the policy aspect. We feel that every household is affected by how they participate, in the social activities around them, which includes the uptake of schemes, the availability and access to beneficiaries, within the household. So that also significantly determines, a household's ability to participate in something which can lead to betterment either through in the social aspects or economic aspects, right? So we see that, hence we see that, I'm, because of the time, I'm not going into the externalities, but we see that women's labor is highly sensitive to a complex network of social, economic, and legal environmental factors, both within and beyond the household, which governs their way of working. And this complexity is not, fully captured in the statistics, which contributes to the data deficits that we have observed. I will now like to call Sadhana to help us understand, the current statistical methods and the gaps that we have identified through our research. Sadhana, over to you.
Thank you, Tripti, and hello, everyone. My name is Sadhana, and I work with Tripti at the Livelihoods Practice Area of SKI, and we're thrilled to have you all with here today for what we believe is an extremely pertinent discussion of urgent relevance. Now that Tripti has given an overview of our journey so far in investigating this topic, I'd like to use the next few minutes to really deep dive into where the dissonance between methodology and reality comes from, and specifically explore how statistical principles and practices serve to obscure the reality of how women work in India. And at this stage, therefore, I'd like to touch upon the United Nations system of national accounts, which is the internationally agreed upon set of principles, recommendations, and practices on how economic data and consequently labor market statistics should be measured and compiled. And this is of critical importance because internationally comparable, consistent, and coherent macroeconomic statistics is key towards building robust economic policy, both at the international, national, as well as at the subnational levels. And so at this stage, it's perhaps useful for us to spend a few minutes outlining what is the scope of the UNSNA, what does it capture, and what activities therefore lie outside of its purview, right? And at the outset, the UNSNA is essentially aimed at measuring all the activities that take place in an economy. And therefore, at the heart of the UNSNA is the production of goods and services. Labor and labor force participation are intrinsically linked, therefore, to activities that contribute towards the production of goods and services. I'll also briefly outline what the UNSNA defines as production, right? And the UNSNA defines production as a physical process carried out under the responsibility, control, and management of an institutional unit in which labor and assets are used to transform inputs of goods and services into outputs of other goods and services. And in order to materialize or implement this definition, the UNSNA uses the concept of a production boundary, which defines the range of activities that are considered production. And critically, this boundary also defines which activities are considered labor for the purposes of national accounts. And what we see from this is that there is a cascading relationship between the concepts of production, labor, and labor force participation. Labor is any activity that is undertaken towards the end goal of production, and a person is counted as within the labor force if they participate in any of these activities, right? Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. And this illustration outlines in an illustrative format what the production boundary of the UNSNA actually means in real life. And at this point, it's also useful to note that this production boundary has been absorbed almost completely intact by the Indian system of national accounts, which is the methodology that is used both to measure GDP as well as labor market statistics in the PLFS. And while it's useful to look at the range of activities that come within the production boundary, far more can actually be gleaned by looking at the list of activities that are excluded from the production boundary. And some examples of activities that are outside the purview of this boundary include the cleaning, decoration, and maintenance of the dwelling occupied by the household, cleaning, servicing, and repair of household durables and other goods, the preparation and serving of meals, the care, training, and instruction of children, the care of sick, infirm, or elderly people, and transportation of various members of the household. And I'll pause here for a second because there is something extremely telling about the list of activities which I just read out, which is that despite adopting a seemingly neutral boundary condition, this method has in fact excluded a whole range of activities that are overwhelmingly performed by women, such as maintenance of the household, the care of children, the care of the elderly, cooking, cleaning, and allied activities, right? And what we've observed, therefore, is that a neutral boundary condition has thus become a value judgment that reflects somewhat patriarchal notions of what actually constitutes productive activity. And the labor that women overwhelmingly perform is categorically placed outside of this boundary. And this demonstrates that gender neutrality alone is not sufficient to achieve gender equality. The production boundary here has made no reference to gender at all, and yet its consequences are highly gendered in nature. And therefore, what we believe is, rather than gender neutrality, the need of the hour is to maintain gender sensitivity, an approach that is responsive to the unique realities, both social and economic, that shape the ways of working of Indian women, as well as their lives as a composite whole. Because what we've observed is also that work and life exist for women on a continuum and cannot be categorically separated from the other. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. While exploring these discrepancies, we came across three key shortcomings of the currently accepted methods of measuring women's labor. And namely, these are the exclusion of women's economic contributions and over-reliance on market-based definitions of production, and a neglect of the external environment, which encompasses social norms, cultural context, as well as economic realities, which are constantly fluctuating, and women's labor strategies and livelihood participation is constantly in response to this. And I'll spend a couple of minutes outlining what we mean by each of these three shortcomings, right? Firstly, when we look at the production boundary, we see that unpaid caregiving services and unpaid domestic services fall outside of the SNA's production boundary when these services are produced and consumed within the same household. What this means is the work that a domestic worker does for a living in other people's homes would be counted as labor, but the work that she performs within her own household would be excluded. And this describes the reality of several and like the overwhelming majority of women's work in India. And while excluding these activities from the production boundary, it's interesting that the United Nations itself acknowledges that a significant amount of time, energy, and labor is expended on these activities, and that these activities are an integral and indispensable contribution to both economic well-being as well as societal welfare. However, the missing link in the SNA's analysis is that the labor that goes into performing these activities is not gender neutral. Rather, it is women who shoulder these responsibilities to an overwhelming degree. In India, for example, it's estimated that women spend nearly 10 times as much time on domestic and household tasks in comparison to their male counterparts. And this reflects a nearly staggering inequality. And thus, we see that a seemingly arbitrary and gender neutral production boundary makes a large part of women's labor invisible, and consequently also devalues their economic contribution, because these activities are not without economic value. It's been estimated that women's contribution to the economy through their unpaid work is approximately 7.5% of the GDP, which is an astronomical figure. Secondly, we also see that there is a lot of emphasis placed on how the market defines productivity and how the market measures value, right? And this manifests itself in two ways. Firstly, it takes an extremely binary and dichotomous approach towards labor. And secondly, it is overly concerned with the quantification of value in purely economic and monetary terms. And taking the first one, we see that the SNA's binary notion of an activity either being production or not production also informs a binary notion of a person being either in the workforce or outside of the workforce. And falling on either side of the binary basically determines whether your work is reflected and accounted for in the national imagination or whether it's rendered invisible. But the reality is that a majority of South Asian women fall in between the extremes of women who are clearly working outside of the home for pay and women who are only working within the household for no pay and just performing unpaid care. And we also see that there is an over-reliance on market definitions, which ignores that women's labor also has a component of social reproduction and therefore social value, as Tripti outlined earlier as well. And even though the generation of this social good cannot be clearly quantified, it remains fundamental to our economic growth as well as societal well-being. Domestic responsibilities and caregiving for family members, for instance, they are critical pillars of household well-being and welfare and things that our society and communities could not do without. And lastly, we also see that existing methodologies do not lead to an appropriate reflection of the external circumstances to which women's labor is highly responsive to. And we see that women's work in India is dominated by high levels of informality, precarious work, and is also in negotiation with the social norms that privilege their position within the household rather than as a paid worker outside of it. But it's also important to note over here that women's participation in paid forms of work, whether informal, precarious, or formal and secure, is frequently undertaken as a consequence of economic distress or economic need at the household level. And this means that it's often seasonal, sporadic, and irregular. An analysis conducted by Professor Deshpande, a highly regarded economist whose work we've counted on quite a bit in this webinar, her analysis of data by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy showed that if you take a short period of time and study a cohort of women, 44% of them are inside the labor force. But as the period of time expands, more and more, like the figure drops to precipitously to 2%. And this shows that women demonstrate a high degree of volatility in engaging with the labor market. They may join it when needed. They may drop out of it when their labor is no longer necessary. And it's a strategy that they develop in conjunction with the household to survive in this economic reality, right? And additionally, this was also a question posed to us in the chat. We see that women are also involved in family businesses, contributing to household enterprises, contributing to subsistence farming. And these are unpaid activities that are nevertheless expenditure saving as well as economically valuable. But because these activities are undertaken within the confines of the household, it's not recognized and it's not remunerated for in a formal manner. These women are not recognized as workers, either by external society or by themselves. So we see that there is also a self-perception issue where women are reluctant to see themselves as workers as well. And we see that women navigate work and labor in a continuum format and not a binary format. They occupy simultaneously roles of a social and an economic actor, and they generate a combination of social and economic value through their labor. And in conclusion, to tie all the threads that we've discussed so far together, we see that women are constantly working and they are constantly laboring. But a vast majority of this is invisible due to flaws in statistical principles and approaches. So their contribution to the economy as well as the social welfare is invisible, but yet indispensable. And that's the dichotomy that our work in this domain is really trying to address. Yes, thank you all so much for your attention during this discussion. I anticipate a very engaging Q&A session this evening, and I will just hand back to Tripti to round off this discussion and then open the floor for your questions. Thanks very much. Hi, Tripti, you're on mute. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Sadhana. The interestingly, our engagement with experts as well as the research highlighted the need to strengthen the statistics, the methodologies that we are doing, using today. Need to change these frameworks and align it to the Indian context, right? Bring in that contextual understanding of the role women play while they are in, participating in agriculture, in their own farms or in their family enterprises or as informal workers, right? So there is definitely a need to relook at these frameworks and see how this macro level data can be improved. Of course, the way we see it is not to build or to create like something new, but then really augment on top of what is available today. I want to advance towards the final part of our presentation where we want to share what we believe as actors working, to advance women economic empowerment, we must do. Can we move to the next slide, please? So, in short and leaving more room for the Q&A, what fundamental thing we believe is that, as actors or people interested in working in this area, we must be cognizant of the range of social and economic factors that influence women's participation, and the factors that determine the ways in which women participate, encompasses the social, economic, and the cultural factors, the diversity of the role women occupy in the society. So it's not really like, whether they are participating or not, right? So there are a range of things which determine that. And I think that's where, the entire ecosystem is still struggling to really find an answer to this, right? But then we have to be cognizant of that, and the identifications of levers that are available to key stakeholders to improve key areas of social and economic well-being for women. And we really feel that, what can drive this is a lot of collaboration and leveraging the collective expertise. It's not the researchers alone, the academicians alone who can build frameworks. It has to be done in partnership with, a lot of people who are working on the ground. And then there is a need for systemic reforms to bring about the normative shift in the statistical methods. So we really need a framework of women economic empowerment for India, right? Like, what does that mean? Like in terms of, because a lot of, theories of empowerment have to be suited to the cultural context, and then building in interdisciplinary synergies to better understand relationships between women economic empowerment and gender equality. So we feel that there are two key areas where, where the ecosystem should be directing its efforts, considering what we are also working on. Number one is to improve the quality of the data available. Then number two is really focusing on building tools and frameworks to inform measurement. And we really feel that, and through our experience, we have seen that you can either build the tools after executing a program and saying, this is the learning that we've got, and hence this is our framework of women economic empowerment, or kind of go hand in hand with what's working in the society, and then, create those frameworks and see how different indicators and factors interplay with each other. So this is where we feel the ecosystem should be directing its efforts. And then, really channelizing all the collaborative efforts to actually achieve this. It's a Herculean task. We all believe that, but I think, this is where we believe our efforts should go. I would just take like a minute to sum up what we discussed in today's webinar. Number one, the labor market statistics that measure women's labor are critical foundation for effective policy design and ecosystem interventions to advance women economic empowerment. However, we see that the methodologies that lead to this figure are underpinned by a range of assumptions and the principles that lead to gender consequences. Number three, the existing methods obscure the contribution of women to the economy, as well as the range of factors that directly impact the manner in which women work through these shortcomings. And these include the exclusion of women's economic contribution because of the range and the diverse nature in which they participate, and over-reliance on the market definitions of productivity. And I would even go and say that, it's a lot because of the way our, the economic policies have been designed, the way we look at economics and dependence on the old theories, right? We may perhaps need to relook at some of the definitions that we have been using in the frameworks that, we are adopting to measure the data. The neglect of the social norms. And we have to understand that, people keep navigating through the social norms, but how are they navigating through it, and how is that dictating the manner in which they participate has to be looked into. We discussed the skewed representation of women's work and a lack of holistic understanding of the factors that determine it, and their far-reaching implications, which limits the effective policy design, as well as the effectiveness of ecosystem action and the interventions targeted at women workers. So I'll end our presentation here, and it would be great if you guys, if there are more questions, we look forward to some of your questions. We also have on the slide, if we can go back and what we are working on and how you can partner with us. So we leave this slide, but then we'd love to, you can speak up or share your questions in the chat.
I just want to come in here quickly and respond to some of the things that I noticed in the chat. And several of you have asked questions about whether fetching water, contributing to animal husbandry within the household, subsistence farming, the wife of a provision store owner who is supporting him in the daily business, and whether these activities are counted within the production boundary of the SNA. And the answer is they are not. And that's the primary critique that we have towards this approach. And I also want to take a couple of minutes to outline that some of the suggestions have been to account or quantify this labor using something called the third-party criterion, which is if a woman is fetching water or cooking for her family, to measure the value of her labor by measuring the cost that it would take to pay someone else to do it. So how much would you pay someone else to bring the water to your doorstep, or how much would you pay a cook to come home and prepare the meals for the family? This has been suggested as one of the alternative methods through which this type of labor can be quantified. However, there is a lot of skepticism both in the ecosystem and among us within the SKI practice area of livelihoods generally, because what once again it does is it defaults to how the market looks at labor. And when you especially look at the Indian labor market and the kind of labor that we propose be quantified through this third-party criterion, the market is not paying fair or decent wages. When we look at domestic work, for example, the care for children that we outsource to care workers in our society, cooks who come and cook for us, people who perform landless agricultural labor for subsistence farms, all of these are types of labor that have been historically devalued by the market. And this type of labor is not undertaken for fair, meaningful, or dignified wages. So the third-party criterion, once again, would default to how the market perceives the value of a certain type of labor to be. And once again, we feel that that approach obscures a large chunk of the value generated through that labor, which is why we are advocating for a more holistic understanding of what value and productivity itself is, and unpacking not just the gendered assumptions that underlie it, but the broader inequalities around it as well.
So I think there is a question.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sadhana, please close
No,
this.
I've just been informed that participants are not able to unmute themselves. So if you have a question, please do paste it in the chat and we will be taking them up.
There's also a question on whether we have seen, the frameworks of women economic empowerment and how they're working across the low and the middle income countries, and how it can, enhance the GDP, etc. How it can significantly impact the economy. So I would, at this stage, I do not have a complete answer to that, because whatever we have seen so far is limited by our research of looking at like about 20 to 25 frameworks, which several philanthropies and non-profit organizations have created and implemented on the ground. But then they have been very specific to their programs, what the indicators that they are trying to measure. So they are often not tied to the larger or the macro impacts that the economic participation of women can actually enable. So we don't see that. And I would say that there is further we can research. There is a need to understand whether someone has taken it at that level. So if we find something, Meghna, we will share our insights with you as well further on that research. But it's an area of exploration that we are still considering and looking at. But this is what we have found so far.
Yeah. Sejal has also brought up a very interesting point on the chat, and could I please have the presentation back up in order to respond to this question to the production boundary slide? Sejal, your point is extremely valuable, and she makes the point that there is a problem with how we interpret own, and which itself is so discriminatory, because it excludes the work that we do for our communities and for societal well-being in general. And if you look at the slide on the production boundary, I hope it's going to come up in just a minute. But on that slide, we see that activities that are outside the scope of the production boundary does include unpaid volunteering that is done for either other households or for the community as a whole. So volunteer work, unpaid work, and we see that women are often at the center of these care and community networks. And in order for such labor to be made invisible, once again, has a gendered component. So absolutely, Sejal, we need to have a broader understanding of, whom labor is actually directed towards, and also count for the labor that, while unpaid, is still indispensable for societal and community well-being.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, what the Economic Advisory Council is also promoting, right, is definitely a way, a newer lens to actually see how women are participating in the economy through several ways, right? Whether it's a volunteering or whether it's, the paid work. So they are actually trying to really create this new frameworks and tools which can lead to the inclusion of all of this that we are talking about, right? Because the aspects which are nuanced to the Indian context is not, I think, one is it's a dated framework as well. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we create frameworks which are more relevant for us. And I think as we go, we will, one of the things that we want to do is actually, create those frameworks so that, the aspects that you guys have highlighted and, the ways in which women are participating gets factored in, whether it's through, like I said, it's agriculture or, as SHG, volunteering for care, because that leads to indirectly leads to the formation of the care economy, right? It can tell us what is the potential. So hence, do we need to, the bigger question in front of all of us is, should we limit our understanding of women's work to just economics, or should we go beyond that? I think that's the argument we are also trying to make, right, through the work that we are doing. I hope that gives you some idea about the direction that we are taking. Are there more questions, Sadhana?
I think there's one final question from Kritagya, who asks, the social and cultural norms vary quite immensely with geography, demography, caste, religion. How do we then decide interventions that can benefit a huge population of women? And I'll just respond first, and then maybe you can come in, Tripti. And this will be our final question that we take on this webinar. You can please email any questions to us, either me or Tripti, or to the Livelihood Practice Area team in general. And we would be happy to respond to you offline. But circling back to Kutakya's question, I think this kind of demonstrates the tension that we as practitioners face between scale and nuanced targeted interventions, right? And I think when we talk about livelihood strategies for women, it will have to be a combination of both. And for some interventions, we may have to make the compromise on scale and really make it nuanced and benefit a particular cohort of women who face extremely specific problems that are a consequence either of the location in which they work, which may be highly remote, and their needs might be more along the lines of market access, enabling public transport infrastructure, getting them to their place of work, and things like that. Whereas alternatively, if we take a city like Bangalore, for example, which is where we are based, an intervention could definitely aim for scale, where we say that we want to improve the working conditions of women construction workers, say. And that is an intervention that can be scaled up because the cohort of women face very similar challenges as a result of market forces, high precarity, and limited employer liability. So I think the choices are there to be made, whether we want sustainable, nuanced, and targeted interventions, or whether we want to benefit huge populations of women. I think each intervention has its own responsibility in this regard, and that's the way that I would choose to strategize any implementing intervention on the ground. Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And we had a great time engaging with all of you. And the questions were extremely engaging as well and forced us to think about future directions for this research. We're looking forward to connecting and collaborating. So feel free to reach out to us over email or on LinkedIn. And yes, thanks for a great afternoon. Thanks very much.